The script unfolds as an archaeological detective story that challenges our understanding of when and how cities first emerged on Earth. Beginning with the unsettling proposition that our first cities may not have been first at all, the narrative weaves through layers of evidence, literal geological strata, suppressed archaeological findings, and ancient records that suggest urban civilization is far older than conventional history acknowledges. The journey moves from the familiar ruins of Mesopotamia to the enigmatic flood layers that separate our world from what came before, exploring how sudden sophistication in architecture, writing, and social organization appeared without the expected developmental phases. The conflict builds between mainstream archaeological timelines and anomalous evidence. Cities buried beneath cities, pre-flood king lists recording impossibly long reigns, and technological capabilities that seem to require centuries of development appearing fully formed. As the script progresses, it examines specific sites where forbidden layers remain unexcavated, asks why certain findings are downplayed or omitted from standard narratives, and contemplates what memories might be encoded in mythology, language, and urban planning itself. The resolution, if it can be called that, is not an answer but a deepening of the mystery. We are invited to consider that we may be living atop the ruins of a civilization we've forgotten, that our cities are acts of remembrance rather than invention, and that beneath the foundations of our oldest known urban centers lie older foundations still, waiting in the dark. The philosophical climax suggests that urbanization itself might be an ancient human instinct, a pattern we've repeated across vast cycles of time, and that the first cities were merely the latest iteration of something far more ancient. The audience is left contemplating whether archaeology is uncovering our origins or merely rediscovering what we once knew. What if every city you've ever walked through was built on top of another city, and that city was built on another, and somewhere far below, in the compressed darkness of forgotten time, there lies a city so old that its existence would unravel everything we think we know about the dawn of civilization? What if the first cities on Earth were never meant to be found? Tonight, we descend into the forbidden records, the suppressed layers, the archaeological silences that whisper of urban centers that should not exist. We explore the unsettling possibility that civilization did not crawl slowly from the earth but erupted fully formed, as if remembering something it had done before. If you're drawn to the kind of history that sleeps beneath accepted narratives, that breathes in the space between what is taught and what is true, consider subscribing. And tell me, in the comments below, where you're listening from tonight, what city stands above you, and what might lie beneath it, waiting in the compressed strata of ages? We are taught a comforting story. That cities emerged gradually, that humanity stumbled slowly from nomadic wandering into settled agriculture, from villages into towns, from towns into the first urban experiments. We're told that Uruk, Uar, Eridu, these Mesopotamian settlements from around 4000 BCE, represent humanity's first attempts at urban life, that they are the beginning. But what if they were not the beginning at all? What if they were already monuments to something older, reconstructions of a pattern that existed before, echoes of cities that drowned beneath catastrophe and time? Stand with me for a moment in the ruins of Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves claimed was the first city ever built, the place where, according to their own records, kingship descended from heaven. The temple here, the House of Aqua, was rebuilt 17 times on the same sacred spot. 17 layers, each structure built precisely atop the footprint of the one before, as if the location itself held a significance that transcended any single generation's memory. But here's what troubles the quiet researchers who work in the early mornings before the heat rises. The earliest levels of Eridu, those deepest foundations, show no primitive phase. There is no awkward experimentation, no gradual learning curve. The architecture is already sophisticated, already aligned to cosmic principles, already demonstrating knowledge of engineering that supposedly took centuries to develop. We see this pattern repeated across the ancient world, this troubling absence of the expected primitive stages. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BCE, 6,000 years before the Sumerians, we find not the simple hunter-gatherer camp we'd expect, but massive carved pillars arranged in complex circular patterns, megalithic construction requiring organization, planning, and symbolic thinking that implies social structures we associate with urban civilization. Yet conventional history insists these builders had no cities, no writing, no agriculture. They simply gathered, carved pillars weighing tons with stone tools, erected them in precise astronomical alignments, then buried the entire complex and walked away. Does this story satisfy you? Does it feel complete? The deeper we dig, quite literally, the more we encounter what archaeologists quietly call anomalous sophistication, a term that means, in essence, this shouldn't be here yet. In the lowest levels of Jericho, beneath layers dated to 9000 BCE, we find massive stone walls, towers, and evidence of urban planning. In Catalhoyuk, dated to 7500 BCE, we discover a town of remarkable density, with houses built so closely together that residents entered through the roofs, with sophisticated art, proto-writing symbols, and evidence of trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. These places were not primitive villages slowly growing. They were urban concepts, fully realized, as if transplanted from a template that already existed in collective memory. But it is the flood layers that truly unsettle. Across the ancient Near East, at sites throughout Mesopotamia, there exists a distinct geological stratum, a layer of water-deposited silt that separates the older ruins below from everything built above. In UR, archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated through occupation layers until he hit a band of clean clay nearly 3 meters thick, devoid of artifacts, the signature of a massive flood. Below that sterile layer, he found more artifacts, more evidence of habitation, older but not more primitive. In fact, in some ways, more refined. At Kish, at Uruk, at Shuruppak, this same flood layer appears, a horizontal scar in the earth marking a boundary between ages. Conventional archaeology dates these floods to various periods, explains them as local phenomena, the routine overflow of the Tigris and Euphrates. But the Sumerians themselves remembered it differently. They called it the flood, the great deluge that divided the world that was from the world that came after. Consider the Sumerian king list, that strange document that records the rulers of the land before the flood. It lists kings with reigns spanning thousands, even tens of thousands of years, Alulim of Eridu who ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar who ruled for 36,000 years. Conventional scholars dismiss these as mythological, symbolic, obvious impossibilities. But what if the impossibility is not in the numbers but in our interpretation? What if these are not literal biological lifespans but dynasties, eras, or measurements in a timekeeping system we no longer understand? And more troubling still, what if they are records of something that existed before the flood layer, before the reset, in cities whose names we still remember but whose true age we cannot accept? The king list tells us explicitly, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Descended again, as if it had descended before. As if kingship, and by extension the urban civilization, it implies was not invented but restored. Tonight, as you listen, perhaps drifting toward sleep, imagine the archaeologist's trowel scraping against that flood layer, that band of sterile clay. Imagine the moment of decision. Do you stop here, at the accepted boundary, or do you continue downward into the forbidden strata, into layers that should not contain what you might find there? Many have stopped. The reasons are complex: funding constraints, academic caution, the career risk of challenging established chronologies. But some have continued, and what they found beneath the flood layers troubles the comfortable narrative of civilization's slow, linear emergence. At Eridu, below the flood stratum, structures emerge that show no less sophistication than those above. At UR, pottery and tools from the pre-flood layers demonstrate craftsmanship equal to, and in some cases superior to, post-flood artifacts. The progression we expect, from crude to refined, from simple to complex, is not there. Instead, there is continuation, or perhaps more accurately, repetition. The post-flood cities were not inventions. They were reconstructions. This pattern of repetition, of building atop the old, becomes more significant when we recognize it's not unique to Mesopotamia. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, dated to approximately 2500 BCE, appear suddenly in the archaeological record with sophisticated urban planning, standardized brick sizes, advanced drainage systems, and a still undeciphered script. There is no clear antecedent, no obvious developmental phase. The cities are simply there, mature, organized, as if the knowledge of urban design was imported fully formed or remembered from some earlier template. And here too, beneath these cities, lower layers remain largely unexcavated, awaiting the archaeologist brave or funded enough to descend. In Egypt, beneath the dynastic layers, beneath the temples and tombs we associate with pharaonic civilization, lie older structures that official chronology struggles to accommodate. The Sphinx, for instance, shows water erosion patterns on its enclosure walls that geologists argue could only have been caused by prolonged rainfall. Yet the Giza Plateau has been arid for thousands of years, long before the Sphinx's traditional dating. If the erosion is from rain, the structure must be far older, dating to a wetter climatic period, perhaps to 10,000 BCE or earlier. And if the Sphinx is that old, what does that suggest about the civilization capable of carving it? The official response has largely been silence or dismissal, a refusal to engage with geological evidence that contradicts historical timelines. But the stone itself remembers the water. Let us speak carefully here about what remains hidden, not necessarily through conspiracy but through the more mundane mechanisms of academic inertia, funding priorities, and the human reluctance to dismantle frameworks that have taken lifetimes to construct. There exist, in the archives of various archaeological institutions, reports that were never published, findings that were catalogued but not celebrated, anomalies that were noted in field journals but omitted from final papers. Why? Often because they didn't fit. A potsherd that thermoluminescence dates to an impossible age. A worked stone found far below the level where worked stones should exist. A layer of ash suggesting catastrophic fire in an epoch when, according to the chronology, there was no one there to start fires. In 2013, researchers analyzing the Sphinx and its enclosing temple used seismic studies and updated geological analysis. Their findings, published quietly in scholarly journals that few outside specialist circles read, suggested construction phases much older than the 4th dynasty attribution. The seismic data indicated subsurface anomalies, voids, structures, pathways, beneath the Giza Plateau, beneath the level of current excavations. What lies there? We do not know. Permission to excavate deeper is rarely granted. The monuments are protected, preserved, and also, in a sense, sealed. What sleeps beneath the tourist paths of Giza? Similarly, ground-penetrating radar surveys at various Mesopotamian sites have revealed subsurface structures at depths below the currently excavated levels, below the flood layers. These structures appear on the scans as geometric patterns, walls, rooms, corridors, the signatures of intentional construction. Yet funding to excavate these deeper layers is extraordinarily difficult to secure. Why disturb the foundations of accepted history? Why risk finding something that requires us to rewrite the textbooks, to reconsider the timeline, to admit that we do not actually know when cities began? Consider Jericho again, that ancient mound in the Jordan Valley. The excavated layers take us back to approximately 9,000 BCE, revealing stone towers and walls that challenge our assumptions about pre-agricultural societies. But the mound itself, the tell, is much deeper than what has been excavated. Ground surveys suggest occupation layers extending further down, potentially into the Younger Dryas period, that climatic upheaval around 10,800 to 9,600 BCE that saw rapid temperature fluctuations, megafaunal extinctions, and, according to controversial hypotheses, possibly a cosmic impact event. What lies in Jericho's deepest layers, beneath the current excavation limits? We have chosen, collectively, not to know. This phenomenon of stopping the dig, of leaving the deeper layers untouched, recurs across the ancient world. At Catalhoyuk, despite decades of excavation, only a fraction of the site has been explored, and the very deepest, earliest layers remain largely undisturbed. At Tepe Yehia in Iran, at Murghar in Pakistan, at countless tells across the Fertile Crescent, the full depth of human presence is unplumbed. Perhaps it is practical limitation, excavation is slow, expensive, painstaking. But perhaps it is also something else. A subconscious boundary, a line we are reluctant to cross because we intuit that beyond it lies evidence that will not fit our story of who we are and where we came from. The Sumerian texts themselves seem aware of this deeper past. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood narratives, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a deluge, but one god, Enki, warns a favored human, instructing him to build a boat and preserve life. After the waters recede, civilization begins again, but the texts are clear. It begins again, not begins for the first time. The language is of restoration, not innovation. The question we must sit with uncomfortably is this: if our first cities were restorations, what exactly were they restoring? To answer this, we must look not only at what was built but how it was built, the knowledge embedded in stone and clay. The city of Uruk, traditionally considered the world's first true city, flourishing around 3500 BCE, presents us with a paradox. It appears in the archaeological record already sprawling, already home to tens of thousands of people, already possessing monumental architecture like the Great Ziggurats, advanced irrigation systems, wheeled vehicles, and a complex administrative bureaucracy documented in the earliest forms of cuneiform writing. This is not a village that grew slowly into a town. This is urban planning on a scale that implies pre-existing knowledge of how cities function, what they require, how populations of such density can be sustained. Where did this knowledge come from? The conventional answer is that it developed in place, that Uruk grew from earlier settlements like Eridu. But Eridu itself, as we've seen, shows no primitive phase. The temple was sophisticated from its earliest levels. We are confronted with a loop of origins, each first city pointing backward to a predecessor, and that predecessor showing no more primitiveness than its successor. The chain of development we expect is absent. In its place is a pattern that looks less like evolution and more like the implementation of a pre-existing plan. Memory made manifest. Let us examine the urban planning itself. Uruk was divided into distinct districts, religious precincts, residential areas, craft quarters, administrative zones. This level of organization requires conceptual sophistication, an understanding of how different urban functions interrelate, how traffic and resources flow, how populations stratify. It requires, in other words, urban theory. Yet urban theory, in our conventional understanding, is something that develops through trial and error across generations of city building. How did Uruk's planners know what they knew? The same question haunts us at Mohenjo-Daro, where the city grid is so precise, so carefully planned, that it looks almost modern. Streets intersect at right angles, houses are built to standardized dimensions, a sophisticated drainage system runs beneath the roads, and there is evidence of citywide planning for sanitation and water supply that would not be seen again in human civilization for millennia. Who taught the Harappans to build this way? Where are the proto-cities where these techniques were developed and refined? They do not exist in the archaeological record, or if they do, they lie beneath layers we have not yet reached. In Mesoamerica, we see the same phenomenon. Teotihuacan, the great city near modern Mexico City, was laid out according to precise astronomical and geometric principles. Its major structures aligned to celestial events, its entire grid oriented to cosmological significance. The city reached its height around 400 CE, but its origins are murky, and the people who built it left no written records explaining their techniques or their intentions. Yet the city exists, massive and orderly, the product of knowledge that had to come from somewhere. Beneath Teotihuacan's foundations, older structures have been found, and locals speak of tunnels, of sealed passages, of chambers that have never been opened. What knowledge is entombed there? This is the nature of the forbidden records. They are often not records we can hold and read, but records written in the language of stone, alignment, and urban geometry. They are records we are still learning to interpret, but which suggest a continuity of knowledge far older than our current timelines acknowledge. Now consider writing itself, that technology so essential to urban civilization, to administration, trade, law, and memory. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of the Sumerians, appears around 3200 BCE, initially as simple pictographs for record-keeping, then rapidly developing into a complex system capable of expressing abstract ideas, poetry, law, and history. The conventional story is that writing was invented to track goods and trade, a utilitarian origin. But within a few centuries, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's first great literary works, demonstrating linguistic and narrative sophistication that seems far removed from mere accounting. How did this leap occur so quickly? Some researchers have suggested that the rapid development of writing systems implies they were not inventions but reinventions, that the concept of encoding language symbolically was remembered or rediscovered rather than conceived for the first time. Intriguingly, other writing systems emerged independently around the same period: Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Proto-Elamite script, early Chinese oracle bone script, all within a relatively narrow window of a few centuries around 3000 to 2000 BCE. Why this sudden, near-simultaneous emergence across disparate cultures? Was there a common source, a shared memory of a time when such things existed before? The Sumerian language itself is an isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no linguistic family. It appears fully formed in the written record, unlike most languages which evolve visibly from earlier forms. Where did Sumerian come from? The people who spoke it told us themselves. They were taught by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood, who brought the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture, law to humanity. The Sumerians did not claim to have invented these things. They claimed to have received them, to have been instructed by beings who preserved knowledge from the antediluvian world. We can dismiss this as mythology, as primitive people trying to explain their own cultural achievements through supernatural narratives. Or we can consider it more carefully. What if mythology is history translated into the language of symbol and archetype? What if the Apkallu represent a memory, distorted by time and oral transmission, of an actual knowledge transfer from a previous, perhaps pre-flood, civilization? Modern technology has given us new ways to read the old records. AI systems trained on cuneiform can now decipher texts that have baffled scholars for decades, revealing connections, patterns, and references that human researchers missed. What these texts increasingly suggest is a worldview in which the Sumerians saw themselves not as originators but as inheritors, not as the first but as those who came after, who were tasked with preserving and rebuilding what had been lost. Let us descend now into the specific silences, the places where excavation stopped or was never permitted to begin, the sites where the forbidden layers await beneath the weight of earth and bureaucracy. Beneath the Great Mosque of Mecca, Islam's holiest site, ground-penetrating radar has detected ancient structures, layers far older than the Islamic period, suggesting settlement or construction from pre-Islamic times, perhaps even prehistoric times. These findings are not discussed in mainstream Islamic scholarship, and no excavation is permitted. The site is too sacred to disturb, and so what lies beneath remains a matter of speculation and sealed silence. What if beneath the Kaaba's foundations lie the remnants of urban structures from an age we have forgotten? The question cannot be answered because the question cannot be physically investigated. In Jerusalem, beneath the Temple Mount, acoustic imaging and ground surveys have revealed a network of chambers, tunnels, and voids. Some are known, the Herodian structures, the Hasmonean cisterns, but others are deeper, older, and their purpose unknown. Political and religious sensitivities make excavation impossible. The Temple Mount is contested ground, sacred to multiple faiths, and any archaeological work risks igniting conflict. So the deeper chambers remain sealed, and their secrets stay buried. But locals, archaeologists working in adjacent areas, whisper of findings that were quickly reburied, of artifacts that did not match the expected chronology, of inscriptions in unknown scripts hastily covered over. This is how the forbidden records remain forbidden. Not always through active suppression but through circumstance, through the intersection of sacredness, politics, and the logistical difficulties of deep excavation. But the result is the same. Our knowledge of the past is incomplete, and the very oldest layers, those that might reveal the true origins of urban civilization, remain tantalizingly out of reach. In Iraq, the land of ancient Sumer, decades of conflict have rendered many sites inaccessible or endangered. Looting has damaged archaeological context irreparably, and the ongoing instability means that systematic deep excavations are nearly impossible. Sites like Eridu, Uar, and Uruk have been partially explored, but vast sections remain untouched, and lower, older layers are often beyond the reach of current projects. In some cases, previous excavations from the early 20th century documented anomalies in lower strata, unusual artifacts, out-of-place technologies, structures that didn't fit the chronology, but these findings were often footnoted or ignored in the final reports. The raw field notes exist in museum archives, rarely consulted, written in the faded ink of dead languages spoken by British and German archaeologists a century ago. Who reads them now? Who goes back to check their work, to see what they saw but could not interpret? Dr. Henri Frankfurt, excavating at Tel Asmar in the 1930s, documented in his private journals, later archived but not widely published. A sealed chamber beneath the temple complex that his team opened. Inside, they found what he described as implements of unknown function and metallic fragments displaying oxidation patterns inconsistent with bronze or copper. He noted that radiocarbon dating was not yet available, but stratigraphic context placed the chamber far older than the Akkadian levels above it, possibly pre-Sumerian. The findings were crated, sent to a museum in Baghdad, and subsequently lost during the chaos of later decades. No photographs of these objects survive in the published record. Did they exist? What were they? We cannot know because the primary evidence has vanished, and only a few lines in a personal journal remain. Such stories are not uncommon. The history of archaeology is littered with finds that were inconvenient, that disrupted the narrative, and which quietly disappeared from the official record, not through malice but through the entropy of time, institutional disinterest, and the prioritization of findings that fit the established framework. The result is a curated past, a version of history assembled from the artifacts we chose to preserve and interpret, while others, the anomalous ones, the troubling ones, languish in storage or are lost entirely. Consider the Baghdad Battery, discovered in 1936 near Kujut Rabu, a site just outside modern Baghdad. It consists of a terracotta jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, which some researchers have suggested could function as a galvanic cell, a primitive battery. Mainstream archaeology dismisses this interpretation, arguing the object was likely used for storing scrolls or as a ritual item. But experiments have shown that when filled with an acidic solution like vinegar or lemon juice, the device does indeed generate a small electric current. If the ancient Mesopotamians had knowledge of electrochemistry, even in rudimentary form, what does that imply about the sophistication of their technological understanding? And why is this finding relegated to the margins, treated as a curiosity rather than a serious challenge to our assumptions about ancient capabilities? Because it does not fit. It disrupts the story we tell ourselves about technological progress, about the slow, linear development from primitive to advanced. If ancient peoples had technologies that we associate with later periods, electricity, optics, advanced metallurgy, then our timelines collapse, and we are forced to consider that knowledge has been lost and regained multiple times across human history, that what we call progress might be merely the latest upward arc in a cycle of rise and fall. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece, is another such anomaly. This device, dated to approximately 100 BCE, is a sophisticated analog computer used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. Its complexity is astonishing, with dozens of gears and a level of mechanical engineering that we did not think existed again until medieval European clockwork. For decades after its discovery in 1901, it was misunderstood or ignored. Only in recent years, with advanced imaging technology, have we begun to understand what it is and what it could do. But it raises the question, if the ancient Greeks possessed this level of mechanical knowledge, what else did they possess that has not survived? And where did they acquire this knowledge? Was it developed independently or was it inherited, perhaps from the earlier Mediterranean civilizations, Minoan, Mycenaean, or even older? The deeper we look, the more we realize that the official story of civilization, the steady upward climb from stone tools to cities, may be a simplification, a narrative imposed on a far messier, more cyclical reality. What if human history is not a line but a spiral, rising and falling, with each civilization building on the ruins, literal and metaphorical, of those that came before? This brings us to the concept of the reset, a term used informally among alternative historians and researchers to describe periods of catastrophic disruption that erased or severely damaged existing civilizations, forcing survivors to rebuild from reduced knowledge bases. The most commonly referenced reset is the Younger Dryas period, roughly 10,800 to 9,600 BCE, a time of dramatic climate upheaval. Temperatures plunged, ice sheets advanced, sea levels dropped and then rose again, and across the globe, megafauna went extinct. Geological evidence from this period includes a layer of sediment rich in iridium and nanodiamonds, materials associated with cosmic impacts. The hypothesis, still contentious but gaining traction, is that a comet or asteroid strike triggered this climatic chaos. If a civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, a civilization that had developed urban centers, agriculture, and technology, the impact and resulting climate disaster would have been catastrophic. Coastal cities would have been inundated by rising seas as the ice melted. Agricultural zones would have been devastated by temperature swings and droughts. Knowledge, if not written or if written on perishable materials, would have been lost within a generation or two. The survivors, scattered and reduced in number, would have retained fragmented memories. Stories of great cities, of a time before the flood, of advanced ancestors whose works were destroyed. Over millennia, these memories would morph into mythology. Tales of Atlantis, of the antediluvian world, of the Apkallu and the civilizing gods. Then, around 9600 BCE, as the climate stabilized, we see the sudden emergence of monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe, of early urban experiments at Jericho, and within a few thousand years, the full-fledged cities of Sumer. This timeline aligns suspiciously well with the aftermath of a reset. A period of reconstruction, of people gathering together once more, pooling their fragmented memories and attempting to recreate what had been lost. The Sumerian king lists before the flood, and after the flood division may commemorate this very transition. Modern geology supports the idea of catastrophic flooding in the ancient past. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis, for instance, suggests that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea breached the Bosphorus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin and submerging vast areas of settled land. If communities lived along the shores of what was then a freshwater lake, they would have been forced to flee as the waters rose rapidly, potentially within weeks or months. This event, traumatic and widespread, could be the historical core of flood myths from the region, the Epic of Gilgamesh's deluge, the biblical Noah's flood, the Greek myth of Deucalion. And if these communities were proto-urban, if they had developed early forms of architecture, agriculture, and social organization, then the flood would have represented not just a natural disaster but the erasure of a civilization, whose memory persisted only in story. But there is evidence of even older floodings, of multiple inundations across different epochs. Core samples from the Persian Gulf show periods of rapid sea level rise that would have drowned the Gulf Basin, which during Ice Age periods was dry land, potentially habitable, potentially home to settlements that are now beneath hundreds of feet of water. Similarly, submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean have been detected through sonar and underwater archaeology, some showing signs of being worked stone, arranged in geometric patterns, suggesting human construction. The most famous is perhaps the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Submerged rock formations that some argue are the remnants of a man-made structure, carved and arranged, possibly from a time when sea levels were lower, over 10,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology is skeptical, attributing the formations to natural erosion processes, but the debate continues, and the site remains enigmatic. What if our first cities are not on land at all, but underwater, drowned by the post-glacial sea level rise that added over 120 meters to ocean depths between 15,000 and 7,000 BCE? What if the settlements we found, Eridu, Uruk, Jericho, are merely the inland survivors, while the true early urban centers, located on the resource-rich coastlines and river deltas of the Ice Age world, are now lost beneath the waves? This is not idle speculation. Marine archaeology in recent decades has revealed that vast areas of continental shelf, now submerged, were dry land during the last glacial maximum. These areas would have been prime real estate for early human settlement, access to fresh water, rich in game and plant resources with moderate climates. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, for instance, was a landmass the size of India during the Ice Age, connecting modern islands and hosting ecosystems that supported large human populations. When the ice melted, it disappeared beneath the ocean. Did it hold cities? We do not know, because surveying the seabed at the scale necessary to detect archaeological sites is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. But the possibility looms, unsettling and profound, that our archaeology is fundamentally incomplete because we are looking in the wrong places, on the land, while the oldest evidence lies beneath the sea. The Sumerians had a word, Abdot-zu or Abzu, referring to the primordial waters beneath the earth, the realm of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. In mythology, The Abzu was the source of all knowledge, the place from which civilization's gifts flowed. Could this be a memory, encoded in religious symbolism, of a time when important centers, temples, libraries, cities, existed in low-lying areas near water, and were lost to the rising seas, their knowledge and culture sinking into the depths, becoming the mythological underworld, the watery abyss from which the gods emerged? Let us speak now of the towers, those vertical structures that define so many ancient cities, that reach upward as if grasping at something beyond the earth. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the step pyramids of Mesoamerica, the Gothic spires of medieval Europe, the skyscrapers of our modern metropolises, towers are a human obsession, recurring across cultures and epochs. Why? The official explanations vary: religious symbolism, a desire to honor the gods, demonstrations of power and wealth, practical uses like observation or defense. But there is a deeper pattern here, a psychological and perhaps even a remembered impulse. The Tower of Babel, described in Genesis, was humanity's attempt to build a structure reaching to heaven, an act of hubris that God punished by scattering the people and confusing their languages. The story is typically read as a moral parable about pride. But what if it is also a memory of a time when great towers were built, when humanity attempted something monumental, and when that attempt ended in catastrophe and dispersal? Ziggurats are solid, artificial mountains, each a representation of the sacred mountain where heaven and earth meet. The Sumerians built them at the center of their cities, and atop each ziggurat was a temple, a dwelling place for the god. But the structure itself required immense labor, resources, and organization to construct. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, for instance, even in its ruined state, is a massive edifice, and when intact, it would have dominated the city's skyline. Why invest so much in something that was not strictly necessary for survival? Because it was necessary for memory. The ziggurat was a physical mnemonic, a way of encoding in the landscape the sacred geography, the cosmology, the connection to the divine or to the past. Each time a new generation saw the tower, they were reminded of where they came from, of the stories of the gods who descended, of the knowledge that must not be forgotten. If we accept the possibility that these early civilizations were reconstructing something they remembered, then the ziggurats and pyramids take on new significance. They are not just religious structures but also monuments to what was lost, attempts to recreate the great works of the antediluvian world. The Egyptians believed the pyramids were built by the gods, or with the gods' guidance, and that they served as gateways, as resonance chambers, as tools for transformation. Modern Egyptology interprets them as tombs, yet no mummy has ever been found in the Great Pyramid, and its construction remains, even with all our technology, an engineering marvel we struggle to replicate. The precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment to true north, the incorporation of pi and phi into its dimensions, the internal chambers and shafts aligned to stellar phenomena. These details suggest a purpose beyond burial. They suggest knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and perhaps physics that was either highly developed or inherited. Who taught the 4th dynasty Egyptians to build this way? They say it was Imhotep, the legendary architect and polymath, who was later deified. But Imhotep himself, in the inscriptions, credits his knowledge to the gods, to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, who in Egyptian mythology was the keeper of sacred knowledge, the scribe of the gods. Thoth, in turn, is often equated with the earlier Sumerian deity Enki, and with Hermes in Greek tradition, and with the civilizing gods found in cultures worldwide, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Viracocha in South America, Oannes among the Babylonians. These figures share common characteristics. They arrive from elsewhere, often from the sea or from the sky. They teach humanity agriculture, writing, law, astronomy, and architecture, and then they depart, promising to return. Are these independent mythological inventions, or are they divergent cultural memories of a common source teachers, perhaps, from a surviving enclave of an older civilization, spreading knowledge to post-cataclysm humanity? Graham Hancock and other alternative historians have popularized this idea of a lost advanced civilization, sometimes called the mother culture, that predated and influenced the rise of subsequent civilizations. Mainstream academia largely rejects this hypothesis due to the lack of direct physical evidence. No undisputed artifacts, No cities clearly dated to pre-Younger Dryas periods showing urban development. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when we consider how much remains unexcavated, underwater, or destroyed by time and geology. What would constitute proof? A city, fully intact, dated reliably to 12,000 BCE or earlier, showing clear signs of urban planning, writing, and technology. Such a discovery would be revolutionary, paradigm-shattering. But consider the conditions required for such a site to survive. It would need to be in a location protected from erosion, tectonic activity, and human disturbance for over 10,000 years. It would likely need to be buried quickly, perhaps by volcanic ash, flooding, or sediment deposition, to be sealed away. And it would need to be found, which requires knowing where to look, funding the excavation, and the willingness to interpret what is found without bias. Could such a place exist? Possibly. There are tantalizing hints. Anomalies on satellite imagery that show geometric patterns beneath deserts or jungles. Sonar readings of underwater structures. Geophysical surveys indicating voids and constructions at depths not yet excavated. Each of these requires verification, funding, and courage to pursue. And each time permission is sought to dig deeper, to explore further, bureaucratic, political, or academic resistance often blocks the way. In Turkey, in the region where Göbekli Tepe was found, ground-penetrating radar has revealed at least 20 additional sites of similar or potentially greater complexity, still buried beneath the soil. Göbekli Tepe itself is only partially excavated. The majority of the site remains underground. The lead archaeologist, before his death, estimated that excavations might continue for another 50 years before the site is fully revealed. What will those deeper layers show? Will they push the dates back even further? Will they reveal connections to other sites, trade goods, or stylistic influences from places even older? The same question applies to every ancient site. What lies beneath? At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, the massive stone walls fitted together with such precision that a blade cannot slip between them. Conventional dating places construction to the Inca period, around the 15th century CE. But Inca legends say they did not build Sacsayhuaman. They found it, and they rebuilt atop older foundations left by a previous people. Modern technology is now giving us tools to see without digging, to read the landscape in ways our predecessors could not. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses to map terrain with extraordinary precision, penetrating jungle canopies and revealing structures hidden beneath vegetation. In the Maya lowlands, LiDAR surveys have uncovered vast networks of ancient roads, causeways, and cities that were completely unknown, quadrupling estimates of the Maya population and urban extent. The jungles of Central America, long thought to be sparsely inhabited by small Maya city-states, are now understood to have supported a civilization of millions, with extensive infrastructure connecting urban centers. What else lies hidden beneath the world's forests, deserts, and waters? LiDAR is expensive and surveys are limited, but everywhere it is deployed, it reveals more than was expected. In Cambodia, around Angkor Wat, LiDAR has shown that the temple complex was merely the ceremonial heart of a sprawling urban landscape, with neighborhoods, canals, and roadways extending for miles in every direction. Angkor was not just a temple. It was a megacity, one of the largest pre-industrial urban centers in the world. And we didn't know this until recently because the forest had reclaimed it, and the technology to see through the canopy did not exist. How many other sites are there, covered by forest or sand, that await the sweep of LiDAR's laser eye? How many urban centers, how many roads, how many clues to the past are still invisible to us? Not because they don't exist, but because we haven't looked in the right way. The Sahara Desert, now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, was, during the African humid period between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, a green savanna with lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. Satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed ancient riverbeds, lake basins, and stone structures scattered across the desert. Rock art from this period shows people herding cattle, fishing, and living in permanent settlements. Where are the cities from this period? If a humid Sahara supported large populations, logic suggests they would have developed urban centers. But most of the Sahara remains unsurveyed at the ground level, and vast areas are inaccessible due to political instability or harsh conditions. What lies beneath the sand? Slowly being revealed by the shifting dunes. In 2018, amateur satellite archaeologists using Google Earth identified a series of geometric shapes in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Large structures made of stone, visible only from above. These structures, called gates due to their appearance, are scattered across lava fields and number in the hundreds. They are roughly 9,000 years old, based on preliminary dating, but their purpose is unknown. No excavation has occurred at most of these sites. Who built them and why? The structures predate the Arabian kingdoms known to history, predate Islam, predate even the biblical patriarchs. They are evidence of a people we don't know, a culture we have no record of, building something on a scale that required organization and effort. Were they isolated tribes, or were they part of a larger network, a civilization that extended across the greening deserts of the Neolithic? This is the nature of our ignorance, vast and only slowly being illuminated. Every year, new sites are found, new anomalies identified, new dates pushed back. The narrative of human history is in constant revision, always expanding backward in time, always revealing that people were doing more sooner than we thought. And yet the core narrative, that cities began in Mesopotamia around 400 BCE, that civilization is roughly 6,000 years old, remains the standard taught in schools. Why the resistance to updating the timeline? Partly, it is the inertia of institutions, the textbooks already printed, the curricula already designed. Partly, it is the career risk for academics who challenge consensus. Unconventional theories are often career-limiting, especially for younger scholars seeking tenure. And partly, perhaps, it is psychological. The comfortable narrative of progress, of humanity slowly climbing from the darkness, is comforting. To suggest that we have risen and fallen multiple times, that we are not the pinnacle of history but merely the latest iteration, is unsettling. It destabilizes our sense of uniqueness, our belief in linear progress. But the earth does not care for our comfort. The earth preserves what happened, indifferent to our narratives. And slowly, patiently, we are learning to read what the earth has written. Consider the genetic record, another form of evidence that is rewriting history. Ancient DNA extracted from bones and teeth is revealing population movements, intermixing, and events that left no written record, but which shaped the human story profoundly. We now know, for instance, that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, carrying fragments of their DNA within us. We know that there were massive migrations during the Bronze Age, waves of people spreading across continents, bringing languages and cultures that replaced or merged with those already present. But the genetic record also shows bottlenecks, moments when human populations crashed dramatically, reducing to small numbers before expanding again. The Toba supervolcanic eruption around 74,000 years ago is one such event, theorized to have reduced human populations to perhaps a few thousand breeding individuals. Did we lose knowledge during these bottlenecks? Did civilizations, if they existed then, vanish, leaving no survivors to remember? More recently, genetic studies of ancient Near Eastern populations show continuity and also discontinuity, arrivals of new peoples, mixings, disappearances. The Sumerians, for instance, were genetically distinct from later Akkadian and Semitic populations that displaced them, suggesting they were an intrusive group, arriving from elsewhere, or perhaps representing a surviving isolate of an older population stratum. Where did they come from? Their language offers no clues, as it is unrelated to any known language family. They are, genetically and linguistically, a mystery. The same genetic techniques are being applied to domesticated plants and animals, tracing the origins of agriculture. Wheat, barley, lentils, these crops were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic Revolution. But the process of domestication is not instantaneous. It requires generations of selection, of choosing seeds from plants with desirable traits, of learning planting, harvesting, and storage techniques. Who did this work? Where are the proto-farms, the experimental gardens where this knowledge was gained? Some have been found, small plots associated with Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic sites. But the transition from wild to domestic, from foraging to farming, still feels abrupt in the archaeological record. Was it invention, Or was it the restoration of a practice remembered from before the cataclysm, adapted to new conditions? There is an argument, quiet but persistent, among certain researchers, that agriculture itself might be older than we think, that the 10,000 BCE date for the Neolithic Revolution marks not the invention of farming but its reemergence, its readoption by peoples who had abandoned it during the climate chaos of the Younger Dryas. If agriculture existed before 12,000 years ago, evidence for it would be extraordinarily difficult to find. Plant remains decompose, fields are eroded or buried, and the tools of early farming, digging sticks, wooden plows, would not survive. What would survive are the crops themselves, if their domestication left a genetic signature, and indeed, some genetic studies suggest that the domestication process for certain crops may have begun earlier than the traditional dates, though this remains controversial and debated. If we entertain, even hypothetically, the possibility of a pre-Younger Dryas civilization with agriculture and cities, what would we expect to find? Very little. Honestly, if that civilization was largely built from organic materials, wood, thatch, mud brick, which decompose, only stone structures would remain, and only if they were not dismantled or buried. This is why monumental stone architecture, like the pyramids or megaliths, is what survives and what captures our attention. But most buildings, most homes, most infrastructure in any civilization is not monumental. It is mundane, and the mundane rarely survives millennia. So the absence of widespread physical evidence for a pre-Younger Dryas civilization is not, in itself, proof that no such civilization existed. It is merely proof that if it existed, it did not build extensively in stone, or its stone structures are now underwater, or buried so deeply that we have not yet found them. This is a negative proof which is always unsatisfying, but it is logically sound. We must be cautious, though, not to let the absence of evidence become an excuse for believing anything we wish. The standard for accepting a lost civilization must remain high. Credible, datable artifacts, sites with clear stratigraphy, and interpretations that fit the evidence better than conventional explanations. What we do have are the myths, the stories told by every ancient culture of a time before, of a golden age, of ancestors who were greater, wiser, who lived longer, who built wonders. The Greeks spoke of Atlantis, a powerful civilization that sank into the sea. The Hindus speak of the Vedic period and the even older Satya Yuga, an age of truth and righteousness. The Chinese reference the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-mythical rulers of great wisdom. Indigenous Australians speak of the Dreamtime, when ancestral beings shaped the land. Across the Pacific, Polynesian legends tell of lost homelands, of islands that sank or were abandoned. Are these all simply fantasies, psychological projections of a longing for a better past? Or are they cultural memories, distorted and mythologized, of real events, floods, disasters, displacements, that destroyed earlier ways of life? The universal nature of these flood and lost civilization myths is striking. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, noted that while myths vary widely in detail, certain themes recur globally. The flood, the fall from paradise, the civilizing hero, the return of the ancestors. Carl Jung would call these archetypes structures embedded in the collective unconscious. But what if they are also historical memories, embedded in collective culture? Modern neuroscience suggests that memory is not stored in individual neurons but in patterns of neural connections, distributed across the brain. Similarly, cultural memory might be stored not in texts, which are fragile and can be lost, but in stories, rituals, architecture, and symbols that are passed down, adapted, but which retain a core truth. The city itself might be such a memory, a pattern we build because we have always built it, because somewhere in our deep past, we learned that gathering together in dense, organized settlements offers survival advantages, defense, trade, specialization, culture. The city is not just a practical innovation. It is also a deeply human expression, almost instinctual. Watch a child build with blocks. Given the opportunity, most will. Stack them into towers, into walls, creating enclosures and structures. This is not taught. It emerges naturally. Is it purely cognitive, the joy of pattern and construction? Or is there something deeper, an echo of our species' long relationship with building, with placemaking? We are, perhaps, the urban ape, the creature that builds, that encloses, that marks territory with permanence. If urbanization is ancient, truly ancient, then the first cities we can see, Uruk, Harappa, Memphis, are merely the latest chapters in a much older story, one that stretches back not 6,000 years but perhaps 12,000, 15,000 or more. Each time we recover from catastrophe, we build again. Each time the waters recede or the climate stabilizes, we gather together and create cities, because that is what we do. That is what we are. The Sumerian king list divides its chronology into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. After the flood, the reigns of kings become more reasonable, a few decades or centuries, still long but not impossibly so. Before the flood, the reigns stretch into the tens of thousands of years. Scholars interpret this as mythology, as a way of saying a very long time ago, in an age different from ours. But what if the numbers, while not literal, are attempting to convey something real, the vast span of time that civilization existed before the flood, the deep antiquity of urban life? What if the list is a compressed history, with each king representing not an individual but a dynasty, an era, a phase of development? If we accept this reading, the message of the king list is clear. Cities are old, far older than the cuneiform tablets on which the list is written. The Sumerians are not the beginning. They are the continuation, the restoration of kingship and urban order after a catastrophic interruption. And if that is true, then every city you walk through today, every street corner and skyscraper, every plaza and monument, is part of an unbroken chain reaching back into the mists of time, back to the first gathering of people who decided to stay, to build, to create something permanent in a world of flux and danger. We are not the first to do this. We are merely the latest. Now, let us turn to the specific forbidden sites, the places where excavation has been halted or where access is restricted, where the deeper layers remain tantalizingly unexplored. In Bosnia, near the town of Visoko, a controversial series of structures known as the Bosnian pyramids have sparked fierce debate. Dr. Samir Osmanagic has argued that several hills in the area are actually ancient pyramids, covered by soil and vegetation over millennia. The largest, the Pyramid of the Sun, if it is indeed a pyramid, would be taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Osmanagic's team has conducted excavations revealing what they claim are paved terraces, tunnels with smooth walls, and concrete-like materials. Mainstream archaeologists dismiss the site as natural geological formations, and the Bosnian government has at times restricted further excavation. The controversy is fierce, with accusations of pseudoscience on one side and accusations of close-mindedness on the other. What is undeniable is that beneath the hills, there are tunnel systems, some clearly carved or modified by humans, containing pottery and other artifacts. Whether the hills themselves are natural or artificial remains disputed, but the site illustrates the difficulty in gaining acceptance for anomalous claims. If the Bosnian structures are pyramids, and if they date to the periods Osmanagic suggests, potentially 12,000 years or older, they would rewrite European prehistory entirely. The stakes are high, and the resistance to investigation is proportional to the paradigm shift such a discovery would entail. In China, the dozens of pyramids near Xi'an, though known to local farmers for centuries, were largely dismissed or ignored by authorities until satellite imagery made them undeniable. The Chinese government has restricted access to many of these pyramids, officially to preserve them, but excavations have been limited. The pyramids vary in size, some rivaling those of Egypt, and their purpose, tombs, monuments, astronomical markers, remains uncertain. What is known is that they are old, potentially from the Xia or Shang dynasties, but possibly older. Ground-penetrating radar has suggested internal chambers, but full excavations have not been permitted. What lies inside? Similarly, in the Siberian wilderness, massive stone structures known as megaliths have been found on Vera Island and other locations. Blocks weighing thousands of tons, precisely cut and fitted, in regions that were supposedly inhabited only by nomadic hunter-gatherers in prehistoric times. The structures are reminiscent of megalithic sites in Europe, Stonehenge, the dolmens of France, but in a region where such constructions were thought not to exist. Dating is difficult because stone itself cannot be radiocarbon dated, only the organic materials found in association with it, and such materials are scarce in the harsh Siberian climate. The sites remain enigmatic, little studied, and largely unknown outside specialist circles. These are not isolated cases. Across the world, there are sites that challenge conventional timelines, that suggest older, more sophisticated activity than the textbooks allow. Each is met with skepticism, which is healthy. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But skepticism can also become dogmatism, a refusal to even consider that the evidence might be pointing to something real. The scientific method requires open inquiry, yet the institutions of science are human, subject to bias, politics, and the protection of established theories. When evidence arises that threatens the paradigm, the first response is often to question the evidence rather than the paradigm. Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, described how scientific paradigms shift. Evidence that contradicts the dominant theory accumulates slowly, dismissed or explained away, until a critical mass is reached and the paradigm collapses, replaced by a new framework that better accommodates the data. We may be in such a pre-paradigm shift period now, with anomalies accumulating, ancient structures, genetic mysteries, mythological consistencies, that do not fit the story of civilization beginning 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The shift, when it comes, will not be easy. Careers are built on the old paradigm, textbooks are written, museum exhibits designed. Change will be resisted. But eventually, if the evidence is compelling enough, change will come. Until then, the forbidden layers remain forbidden, not necessarily through conspiracy but through the inertia of institutions, the scarcity of funding, the practical difficulties of deep excavation, and the career risks of pursuing unpopular theories. The records are there, waiting in the earth, but they are not easily read. They require patience, resources, and above all, the willingness to question what we think we know. Let us consider what it would mean, practically and philosophically, if we were to confirm that urban civilization is twice as old, or 3 times as old as currently believed. It would mean that the span of recorded history, which we now measure as roughly 5,000 years from the first cuneiform tablets to the present, is merely a fraction of the true story. It would mean that for every year of history we can read, there are 2 or 3 or more that are lost, recorded only in stone, in myth, in the layers of earth we have not yet excavated. It would mean that the great works we admire, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the megalithic temples, might be part of a tradition far older than we imagined, that their builders were not pioneers but inheritors, working from templates passed down through generations, perhaps through millennia. It would mean that knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, engineering might have been discovered, lost, and rediscovered multiple times across human history. And it would mean that we, today, are not necessarily at the pinnacle of human achievement. We are simply in our particular upward arc, benefiting from a stable climate and accumulated knowledge, but potentially as vulnerable to collapse as any civilization before us. The cities we build today, the skyscrapers of steel and glass, the sprawling metropolises of concrete, might one day be the mysterious ruins that puzzle future archaeologists, if we fail to maintain our trajectory, if catastrophe comes. This brings us to the philosophical heart of the matter. Why does it matter if civilization is older than we think? What difference does it make if the first cities are 6,000 or 12,000 or 20,000 years old? It matters because it changes our understanding of human nature. If we rose from primitiveness only once in a single linear progression, then we are the culmination, the apex, the species that finally got it right. This is a comforting story, a narrative of destiny and progress. But if we have risen multiple times, if civilizations have come and gone, each building on the ruins of the last, then we are not destiny's children but survivors, inheritors of both success and catastrophe. It means that collapse is always possible, that what we build can be unmade, that memory is fragile. It also changes how we view knowledge. In the linear model, knowledge accumulates. We know more today than yesterday, more this century than the last. Science and technology are irreversible gains. But if knowledge has been lost and regained, if the ancients knew things we are only now rediscovering, then progress is not guaranteed. Knowledge must be preserved, actively, or it disappears within a generation. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the loss of the knowledge it contained, becomes not just a historical tragedy but a warning that everything we know is one catastrophe away from oblivion. Consider the knowledge encoded in oral tradition, in myth and song. Indigenous cultures worldwide have preserved histories through oral transmission for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians speak of events, rising seas, volcanic eruptions, changes in the landscape, that geologists confirm happened over 10,000 years ago. The stories were passed down generation to generation, adapting in form but retaining factual cores. This is knowledge preservation without writing, proof that information can survive across deep time if the culture values it enough to remember. But oral tradition is vulnerable. A single generation that fails to pass on the stories, a cultural disruption, a genocide, and the knowledge is gone. This is what happened across much of the world during colonization. Indigenous knowledge systems were suppressed, languages forbidden, stories lost. We are only now, belatedly, recognizing the value of what was destroyed, the botanical knowledge, the ecological wisdom, the historical memories embedded in those traditions. If a global catastrophe were to strike today, a supervolcano, an asteroid impact, a runaway climate shift, how much of our knowledge would survive? Our books would decay within decades. Our digital storage is fragile and dependent on technology that might not function. Ironically, the most durable records we are creating are likely the massive stone and concrete structures, the dams, bridges, skyscrapers, that would stand as mute testimony to a lost civilization, much like the pyramids and megaliths of the past. Future archaeologists, if they arise, would puzzle over our ruins, much as we puzzle over those of the ancients. They would find our cities buried and broken, and perhaps they too would debate whether we were the first or merely another iteration. This cyclical view of history is not new. The ancient Greeks believed in cycles, in ages that rose and fell. Hesiod spoke of 5 ages of man: golden, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron, each declining from the one before, until the cycle would begin again. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles of time, with each cycle moving from order to chaos before renewal. Even the Bible contains echoes of this in the vision of kingdoms rising and falling, in the prophetic cycles, in the idea that what has been will be again. Modern secular thought largely rejects cyclicality in favor of linear progress, but the evidence of history does not necessarily support that optimism. Civilizations do fall. Rome fell. The Maya cities were abandoned. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously around 1200 BCE, in an event still not fully understood, where literacy, trade, and urban life vanished across vast regions for centuries. These collapses are real, documented, and they remind us that complexity and sophistication are no guarantee of permanence. So when we dig into the earth and find evidence of older cities, of earlier complexity, we are not just uncovering the past. We are being reminded of the pattern. We are seeing that we are part of a cycle, that the city, this gathering of people into dense, organized, specialized communities, is something humanity does, has always done, and will likely do again if given the chance after any future collapse. The forbidden records, then, are not just archaeological curiosities. They are mirrors reflecting our own vulnerability, our own dependence on the continuity of memory and the stability of the earth and climate. They are warnings written in stone and clay that tell us, we have been here before, we have built before, and we have fallen before. Whether we heed that warning, whether we take steps to preserve our knowledge and to build sustainability into our civilizations, remains to be seen. But there is also something profoundly hopeful in these records. They tell us that humanity is resilient, that we can recover from catastrophe, that even after the flood, after the collapse, after the forgetting, we gather together again and build. The impulse to create, to organize, to reach upward, is apparently ineradicable. We are builders by nature, and as long as we survive, we will build. Look at the cities around you tonight, the lights spreading across the landscape, the hum of activity that never stops. We are living in one of the densest, most interconnected, most urban periods in human history. More than half the world's population now lives in cities, a percentage that was reversed just a century ago. We are, collectively, engaged in the largest urban experiment ever attempted, creating megacities of tens of millions, building upward into super-tall skyscrapers, burrowing downward into subways and tunnels. Are we inventing this, or are we remembering? Is the smart city, the vertical farm, the arcology of science fiction a new idea? Or is it an old idea, surfacing again from the depths of cultural memory? We cannot know for certain, but the question is worth asking. Let us return, for a moment, to the specific anomalies, the pieces of evidence that do not fit, that suggest the timeline is wrong. In the 1970s, a limestone block was discovered in a quarry at Iad, Romania, embedded in sediment alongside mastodon bones, suggesting a date of at least 11,000 years, possibly older. The object, roughly the size of a human forearm, was sent for analysis. It was found to be a manufactured piece of aluminum, a metal that does not occur naturally in pure form and requires sophisticated smelting and refining processes to produce. Aluminum production was not achieved by humans until the 19th century CE. The object's purpose is unknown. Some have speculated it might be part of a tool or machine, but its existence is deeply anomalous. Mainstream science has largely ignored it or suggested it is a hoax, but it remains in a museum in Cluj-Napoca, an enigma. Similarly, the Koso artifact, discovered in 1961 in California, appeared to be a spark plug encased in a geode-like concretion. The concretion was initially thought to be ancient, perhaps 500,000 years old based on the fossils it contained, which would make a spark plug inside it impossibly anachronistic. Further investigation suggested the incrustation was not that old, and the object might be a 1920s spark plug that became encrusted relatively quickly under the right mineral conditions. The artifact is now lost, so verification is impossible, but it illustrates the challenges in assessing out-of-place artifacts. Contamination, misidentification, and the loss of primary evidence are constant problems. These objects, whether genuine anomalies or misinterpretations, point to a larger issue. How do we assess evidence that contradicts the established framework? The scientific method requires skepticism, repeatability, and peer review, all of which are difficult with unique archaeological finds. A single artifact, no matter how strange, is not enough to overturn a paradigm. Multiple lines of evidence from different sites, independently verified, are needed, but that verification is often not pursued. If an artifact is too anomalous, it is easier to dismiss it as a hoax, a misidentification, or contamination than to investigate deeply. This is not necessarily malice. It is the practicality of limited resources and the statistical likelihood that most anomalies are indeed errors rather than genuine challenges to the paradigm. But the result is a self-reinforcing cycle. Anomalies are dismissed, so they are not studied, so they remain unverified, so they continue to be dismissed. What would break this cycle? A discovery so undeniable, so well documented, and so widely witnessed that it could not be ignored or explained away. The opening of a sealed chamber beneath the Sphinx, for instance, revealing artifacts or inscriptions that definitively date the structure to 10,000 BCE or earlier, would be such a discovery. The excavation of a city beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf or Sunda Shelf, with clear stratigraphy, datable organic materials, and evidence of urban planning, would be another. Such discoveries may yet occur. The technology exists, the sites are there, and the will to explore them is growing. In the meantime, we piece together the fragments we have. We look at the flood layers, the sudden sophistication, the mythological consistencies, the genetic bottlenecks, the submerged coastlines, and we construct a hypothesis. That civilization is older than acknowledged, that it has risen and fallen multiple times, and that the cities we call first are actually reconstructions, acts of cultural memory manifesting in clay and stone. This hypothesis is not yet proven, but it is not disproven either. It remains in the realm of the plausible, waiting for the evidence that will either confirm it or refute it decisively. And as we wait, we continue to dig, to scan, to analyze, slowly expanding the borders of what we know. There is a concept in archaeology called settlement continuity, the idea that humans tend to occupy the same locations across long periods of time because those locations offer strategic or resource advantages, water, defensibility, trade routes. Many modern cities sit atop ancient ones for this reason. London is built on Roman Londinium, which was built on earlier Celtic settlements. Paris sits on ancient Lutetia. Istanbul is built on Byzantine Constantinople, which was built on Greek Byzantium, which was built on even earlier settlements. The land remembers, and we return to it. Beneath Mexico City lies Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and beneath Tenochtitlan, archaeological layers reveal earlier settlements. The site has been occupied for thousands of years because the valley, with its lakes and fertile land, was ideal for habitation. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, the cities were built along the rivers because the rivers provided water, transportation, and irrigation. The locations were chosen for practical reasons, but the result is a vertical stacking of history, each city built atop the ruins of the one before. To excavate these sites fully would require dismantling the modern cities above them, which is obviously impractical. So we excavate where we can, in vacant lots during construction projects in peripheral areas, and we extrapolate from these limited glimpses what the whole might have looked like. It is archaeology as a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, where we reconstruct the image from fragments and educated guesses. But occasionally, a site is found that is not buried beneath a modern city, a site that was abandoned and left to the elements, and at these sites we can dig deeper. Catalhoyuk, for instance, is such a site, and its excavation has revealed astonishing details about Neolithic life. But even at Catalhoyuk, the deepest layers remain largely unexcavated, awaiting future archaeologists with better technology and more time. Every excavation is a choice, a decision about what to prioritize, what to study, what to preserve, and every choice leaves other things unexplored. The soil is patient. It will wait. But we, with our brief lifespans, must choose what questions to ask, what mysteries to pursue. And so we focus on what fits, what confirms, what builds upon the existing structure of knowledge. The anomalies, the forbidden records, the suppressed layers, they wait in the dark, silent, until someone cares enough to bring them into the light. There is a certain romance to the idea of forbidden knowledge, of secrets hidden by authorities who fear the truth. But the reality is usually more prosaic. The records are forbidden not because of conspiracy but because of neglect, lack of funding, political instability, or the sheer overwhelming volume of material that exists. There are tens of thousands of archaeological sites around the world, most only partially explored, and millions of artifacts in museum storage that have never been fully analyzed. The work of archaeology is painstakingly slow, and the resources available are limited. Choices must be made, and often the choice is to focus on what is already known rather than to venture into the uncertain. But there are exceptions, moments when the uncertain is explored, and the results are transformative. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, hidden in jars in caves near Qumran, revolutionized our understanding of Second Temple Judaism and the textual history of the Bible. The scrolls had been sealed away for nearly 2,000 years, waiting. Similarly, the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, revealed Gnostic Christian texts that had been lost for centuries, providing new perspectives on early Christian diversity. These finds were accidental, the result of local people stumbling upon jars in remote locations. How many other such caches exist, still hidden, still waiting? In Iraq, the looting of the National Museum of Iraq during the chaos following the 2003 invasion resulted in the loss of thousands of artifacts, some of which have been recovered, but many of which remain missing. Among the lost items were cylinder seals, tablets, and artifacts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian periods. These objects were not just valuable. They were irreplaceable records of human history, pieces of the puzzle of where we came from. Their loss is incalculable, not in monetary terms but in terms of knowledge that can never be regained. And in the chaos, we must wonder, were there artifacts in that museum, stored in back rooms, catalogued but not published, that contained information that would have challenged our understanding? We will never know because they are gone. This vulnerability of knowledge, its dependence on physical preservation and institutional continuity, is a recurring theme. The Library of Alexandria, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the libraries of Nalanda in India, all were destroyed, their contents lost. Each time, humanity suffered a setback, a forgetting. And each time we rebuilt, slowly reconstructing what was lost. But reconstruction is not the same as continuity. There are gaps, errors, interpretations that diverge from the originals. The game of telephone played across centuries results in distortions, and we are left trying to discern the original message from its echoes. Mythology, perhaps, is one such echo. The stories have been told and retold, changed and adapted, but the core remains. The flood story, for instance, appears in Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, and indigenous American traditions, among others. The details vary. Sometimes it's a wrathful god. Sometimes it's environmental. Sometimes there's an ark. Sometimes a mountain. But the core narrative of a great flood that destroyed the world and from which a remnant survived is consistent. This global distribution suggests either independent invention, which is possible given that floods are natural disasters that occur everywhere, or a common source, a real event so traumatic that it was remembered and retold across cultures. Geologists confirm that catastrophic flooding has occurred multiple times in human history. The Black Sea deluge, the flooding of the Persian Gulf, the outburst floods from glacial lakes at the end of the Ice Age, which released quantities of water so vast they raised global sea levels noticeably. Any coastal or riverine population experiencing such an event would have seen it as world-ending, and the story would have been passed down. Over millennia, the stories merge, mythologize, and become the flood narratives we read in ancient texts. But if the flood stories are rooted in real events, what about the other elements of mythology? The stories of gods descending from the sky, of civilizing heroes who teach humanity the arts of life, of giants and advanced ancestors? Are these also distorted memories, or are they purely imaginative? The scientific method cannot answer questions about events for which no physical evidence exists. We can study the flood layers, the sea level changes, the climate data, and correlate them with mythological accounts. But we cannot excavate a god, cannot carbon date a legend. So we are left with interpretation, with the choice to read mythology as history, as psychology, as literature, or as some combination of all three. What we can say is that the ancients took their myths seriously. They built temples to the gods, performed rituals, structured their societies around cosmological principles. The myths were not entertainment. They were sacred truth, the foundational narratives that explained existence. To dismiss them entirely as fantasy is to ignore the role they played, the information they encoded, and the possibility that they contain, however distorted, kernels of historical truth. Consider the Sumerian god Enki, lord of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, bringer of civilization, patron of wisdom and magic. Enki's myths describe him as a creator, a trickster, a teacher who gave humanity the MES, the divine decrees or cultural norms that made civilization possible. In one myth, Enki creates humans to serve the gods, to work the land and dig the canals. In another, he warns the human Zayusadra of the coming flood, instructing him to build a boat. Enki is complex, multifaceted, simultaneously divine and relatable. Is Enki purely mythological, a personification of water, fertility, and wisdom? Or does he represent something more, a cultural memory of a leader, a group of teachers, a civilization that came from across the water and taught the people of Mesopotamia how to farm, to write, to build? The texts themselves are ambiguous, and we, reading them millennia later, cannot know for certain. But the possibility is there, lingering, unsettling. As we move deeper into this exploration, we must confront the limitations of our own knowledge and the biases inherent in our interpretations. History is written by the victors, by those who survive, and archaeology is the study of what survives. We piece together the past from fragments, broken pottery, worn coins, degraded bones, collapsed walls. From these, we infer life, belief, society. But inference is not certainty. We construct narratives, but the narratives are ours, shaped by our culture, our questions, our expectations. The ancient peoples left us their works, but they did not leave us their thoughts, not directly. We read their texts, but translation is interpretation, and much is lost in the conversion from Sumerian or Akkadian or Egyptian into English. Nuances, wordplay, cultural contexts, these do not translate easily. The cuneiform tablets speak, but what they say depends on who is listening and how they choose to hear. Take, for example, the Sumerian word Anunnaki. Translated literally, it means something like princely offspring, or those who came from heaven to earth. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki are a group of deities associated with the earth and the underworld, often in contrast to the Igigi, who are associated with the heavens. Conventional mythology treats them as gods in the polytheistic pantheon, each with roles and stories. But in the late 20th century, Alternative historians, most notably Zecharia Sitchin, proposed a radical reinterpretation. That the Anunnaki were not gods but extraterrestrial beings, who came to Earth, genetically engineered humans as a labor force, and whose activities are recorded, literalized, in the myths. Sitchin's theories, based on his own translations of Sumerian texts and interpretations of ancient astronomy, have been widely popularized but are rejected by mainstream scholars, who point to mistranslations, misunderstandings of cuneiform, and a lack of supporting evidence. Who is right? Sitchin's literalist reading of myth as alien history is almost certainly incorrect in its specifics, but his underlying question is worth considering. Are the myths describing something real, albeit in symbolic language? If we strip away the assumption of extraterrestrials, but retain the idea that the Anunnaki represent memory of real people, leaders, teachers, perhaps survivors of an earlier civilization, then the myths take on a different character. They become not fantasy but history told in the language of the sacred. This is the challenge and the opportunity of studying ancient records. They are polyvalent, capable of multiple interpretations, and the truth may lie somewhere between the literal and the purely symbolic. The ancient scribes who wrote these texts believed them to be true. But true in what sense? Historically factual, spiritually true, culturally foundational, all of the above? We must be careful not to impose our categories, history, mythology, science, on cultures that did not think in those terms. For the Sumerians, there was no separation between the sacred and the mundane, between history and myth. The gods acted in the world, kings were semi-divine, and the past, present, and future were woven together in a cosmic order. To understand their records, we must try to think as they thought, to see the world as they saw it, and that is extraordinarily difficult across a gulf of 5,000 years. And yet, we must try, because embedded in their texts, in the king lists and the flood stories and the god myths, there may be information that tells us not just about them but about us, about where we came from, about the deep roots of human civilization. Let us consider one more piece of evidence, one more anomaly: the precision of ancient astronomy. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, had a sophisticated understanding of the heavens. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and developed mathematical models of celestial cycles that were astonishingly accurate. The Babylonian astronomers knew the length of the lunar month to within seconds of the modern value. They recorded planetary positions and identified long-term cycles, such as the Saros cycle for eclipses, which repeats every 18 years and 11 days. This level of precision requires centuries of observation, careful record-keeping, and mathematical sophistication. But more than that, it requires motivation. Why did they care? The usual answer is astrology, that the Babylonians believed the movements of the heavens influenced earthly events, and so they studied the stars to predict the future. This is true, but it does not fully explain the precision. You do not need to calculate the lunar month to the second in order to cast a horoscope. The level of accuracy the Babylonians achieved suggests a deeper interest, a desire to understand the cosmos for its own sake, or perhaps for purposes we do not fully understand. There are also suggestions, controversial and debated, that some ancient astronomical knowledge was far older than the observations themselves. The precession of the equinoxes, for instance, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the equinoxes against the background stars to shift over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, was understood by the ancient Greeks, notably Hipparchus around 130 BCE, who is credited with its discovery. But some researchers argue that knowledge of precession is encoded in earlier myths and monuments, that the alignments of structures like the pyramids or the orientation of certain myths to constellations suggest an awareness of precession long before Hipparchus. If precession was known earlier, how much earlier? To detect it requires observations spanning centuries, ideally millennia, because the shift is so gradual. This would imply a tradition of astronomical observation and record-keeping stretching back into the Neolithic or earlier, a continuity of knowledge that survived the rise and fall of cultures. Is this possible? Perhaps. Oral traditions can preserve information across long periods, and if astronomical knowledge was considered sacred, it would have been carefully guarded and passed down. The night sky, unlike almost anything else, is eternal in human terms. The stars we see are the same stars our ancestors saw, their patterns unchanged over the span of recorded history. If you wanted to preserve knowledge across millennia, encoding it in the stars, in myths tied to constellations, in monuments aligned to celestial events, would be a reliable method. The stars do not burn, do not decay, do not get lost in wars or floods. They are always there, patient, waiting for someone to read them. Did the ancients do this? Some researchers believe so. The zodiac, the 12 constellations through which the sun passes over the course of a year, is ancient, with origins in Babylonian astronomy but possibly earlier. The constellations themselves, the patterns of stars we see as animals, heroes, objects, are cultural constructs, differing across civilizations, but certain constellations are remarkably consistent. Orion, the hunter, is recognized in Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian traditions. The Pleiades, a star cluster, is significant in cultures worldwide, from Greek myth to Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime to Native American traditions. Why this consistency? Perhaps because these are the most obvious and visually striking patterns in the sky, naturally drawing attention. Or perhaps because they are very old, their myths and names passed down from a common ancestral tradition before the dispersion of human populations across the globe. If the latter, then the constellations are another form of cultural memory, another record of a time when humanity was more unified, before languages diverged, before migration scattered us. There is a theory, speculative and far from proven, that the constellation myths encode astronomical data, specifically the position of the equinoxes. As the Earth's axis precesses, the constellation in which the sun rises on the spring equinox slowly changes, moving backward through the zodiac over the 26,000-year cycle. This age lasts roughly 2,160 years per constellation. We are currently transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, a shift that has captured popular imagination. Before Pisces was Aries, and before that Taurus, and so on. Some researchers argue that mythological narratives encode these transitions, that the shift from the worship of bull gods, Taurus, to ram gods, Aries, around 2000 BCE, for instance, reflects the precession of the equinoxes. If true, this would mean that ancient peoples were not only aware of precession but were tracking it and embedding it in their religious symbolism. This is a profound level of astronomical awareness, and it pushes the origins of such knowledge back further than we conventionally accept. The Sphinx, again, becomes relevant. If the Sphinx is much older than the 4th dynasty, if it was carved during the age of Leo, roughly 10,500 BCE when the constellation Leo rose heliacally at the spring equinox, then the Sphinx's leonine form would be a marker, a celestial timestamp encoded in stone. This is the argument made by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, among others, in their work on the Orion correlation theory, which suggests that the layout of the Giza pyramids mirrors the stars of Orion's belt, and that the entire Giza complex is a map of the sky as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. Mainstream Egyptology rejects these theories, citing lack of evidence and the reliance on selective interpretation. But the questions raised are intriguing. Why align monuments to stars? What knowledge were they trying to preserve or display? Alignments are undeniable facts. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy that modern engineers struggle to explain. Stonehenge is aligned to the solstices. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is aligned to the spring equinox, and the entire temple complex is laid out according to astronomical and numerological principles. The Mayan pyramids encode the Venusian cycle, the solar year, and the long count calendar. These are not accidents. They are intentional, the product of careful observation and sophisticated mathematical understanding. Why go to such effort? The usual explanation is religious, that the rulers wanted to align their power with cosmic order, to demonstrate that their authority was sanctioned by the heavens. This is plausible, but it also suggests that cosmology, the understanding of the universe, was central to these cultures in a way that is difficult for us in a secular age to fully grasp. The sky was not just a calendar or a source of omens. It was the structure of reality itself, and to understand it, to align oneself with it, was to participate in the divine order. If we accept that ancient astronomy was more advanced than we give it credit for, then we must also ask, where did this knowledge come from? Was it developed independently by each culture, a natural result of agricultural societies needing calendars? Or was it transmitted, shared across cultures, perhaps from a common source? The similarities are tantalizing. The The Sumerian base 60 number system, which we still use for time 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angular measurement 360 degrees in a circle, is mathematically sophisticated and seemingly arbitrary. Why 60? Because it has many divisors, making it convenient for calculation. But it is also an odd choice, not obvious. Did other cultures independently arrive at base 60, or did they learn it from the Sumerians, or did the Sumerians learn it from someone even earlier? Similarly, the measurement systems of the ancient world, cubits, stadia, feet, show curious relationships, sometimes differing by factors that suggest a common origin, a standard unit from which others were derived. John Neal, in his work on ancient metrology, has argued that there was a sophisticated, integrated system of measurement in the ancient world, used in construction and trade, that implies a level of international coordination or a shared inheritance from an earlier standard-setting culture. These threads, mythology, astronomy, metrology, flood geology, sudden urban sophistication, weave together into a tapestry that is incomplete, frustrating, and profoundly suggestive. Each thread alone is not enough to overturn conventional history, but together they form a pattern that demands attention. They suggest that the story we tell ourselves, the comfortable narrative of progress from cave to city, is at best simplified and at worst fundamentally wrong. What, then, is the alternative narrative? It goes something like this: human beings have been behaviorally modern, meaning cognitively and culturally capable of everything we do today for at least 70,000 years, possibly much longer. For most of that time, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, but this does not mean we were primitive in thought or capacity. We had language, art, spirituality, and social structures. We observed the world, told stories, passed down knowledge. At some point, possibly as early as 15,000 to 12,000 years ago, in a climatically favorable period, some groups began to settle, to experiment with cultivation, to build more permanent structures. This process was disrupted by the Younger Dryas, a catastrophic climate shift possibly triggered by a cosmic impact, which caused widespread extinctions, sea level changes, and the collapse of whatever nascent civilizations had begun to form. The survivors, reduced in number and scattered, retained memories of what had been. As the climate stabilized after 9600 BCE, they began to rebuild. They gathered at places like Göbekli Tepe, creating monumental structures that suggest organization and shared purpose. Over the following millennia, they redeveloped agriculture, re-established settlements, and eventually, around 4000 to 3000 BCE, the full urban civilizations of Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, and others emerged. These civilizations did not arise from nothing. They arose from a long prehistoric process, much of which is lost to us because the evidence was destroyed, buried, or submerged. The myths of these civilizations, the flood stories, the tales of gods and ancestors, are distorted memories of the earlier time, of the pre-cataclysm world, and of the knowledge that was preserved and passed down. This narrative is speculative, and it is not universally accepted, but it is consistent with the evidence we have and with the anomalies that conventional history struggles to explain. It suggests that human history is older, more complex, and more cyclical than we acknowledge, that we are not the first to build cities, not the first to study the stars, and potentially not the first to reach for greatness. And if we are not the first, then the question becomes, what can we learn from those who came before? Can we avoid their fate? Can we preserve our knowledge in a way that would survive a catastrophe? These are not idle questions. We live in a time of climate change, geopolitical instability, and technological risk. The possibility of collapse, of a rapid decline in complexity, is not remote. It has happened before, and it can happen again. The ancient records, forbidden or otherwise, are not just about the past. They are about the present and the future. They are warnings, lessons, and inspirations. They tell us that we are resilient, that we can rebuild, but also that we must be vigilant, that what we build can be unmade. So what do we do with this knowledge, tentative and incomplete as it is? We continue to seek. We support archaeology, open-minded inquiry, the excavation of deeper layers. We encourage interdisciplinary approaches, bringing together geologists, geneticists, linguists, and mythologists to collaborate on the questions of human origins. We preserve our own records in multiple formats, in multiple locations, against the possibility that future generations will need them. And we listen to the earth, to the stories it tells through its strata, its fossils, its ruins. We listen to the myths, reading them not as fantasy but as the memory of peoples who experienced realities we can only imagine. We listen to the stars, which have guided and inspired humanity since we first looked up. The first cities on Earth, whether they were in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago or somewhere else 12,000 years ago or even older, represent a threshold, a moment when humanity committed to a new way of living. We chose to gather, to build, to invest in permanence despite the knowledge, intuitive or learned, that nothing is permanent. We chose complexity, specialization, and interdependence, accepting the vulnerabilities those choices entail. Every city is an act of faith, a bet that the future will continue, that the effort of building will be rewarded, that the community will endure. And every city is also an act of memory, a continuation of a pattern that goes back as far as we can see and likely further still. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those first builders, whoever they were, wherever they were, digging the first foundations, stacking the first stones, making permanent what had always been temporary. Imagine their hopes, their fears, their dreams of what their city would become. And recognize that you are their descendant, not just genetically but culturally, that you live in the world they began to make, and that the impulse that drove them drives us still. The forbidden records are not truly forbidden. They are merely hidden, waiting beneath the earth, beneath the water, beneath the weight of accumulated time. They are there, patient, enduring, ready to speak to us if we are ready to listen. And when we finally uncover them, when we finally read the full history of cities and civilization, we will understand not just where we came from but who we are. We are the builders. We are the rememberers. We are the ones who, after the flood, after the fire, after the forgetting, gather together once more and say, "Here, on this ground, we will build." And in that act, we honor all who came before, all who will come after, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be erased. Let us conclude by contemplating what lies ahead. If our understanding of the past is incomplete, our vision of the future is equally uncertain. But the past offers guidance, patterns, lessons encoded in the rise and fall of civilizations. One pattern is clear: isolation is fragile. Civilizations that became isolated, that lost contact with broader networks of trade and knowledge, were more vulnerable to collapse. The classic Maya, though brilliant in astronomy, architecture, and art, were eventually undone by a combination of drought, warfare, and environmental degradation. The isolation of the Maya city-states, their inability to cooperate or to adapt collectively to crisis, contributed to their downfall. In contrast, civilizations that maintained networks, trade, communication, cultural exchange were more resilient. The Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations, despite their eventual collapse, persisted for centuries because they were interconnected, able to share innovations and resources. For us today, hyperconnected by technology, the risk is different. We are not isolated, but we are fragile in new ways. Our dependence on complex systems, electrical grids, supply chains, digital infrastructure, means that a cascading failure could have rapid, catastrophic effects. And our knowledge, increasingly stored digitally, is vulnerable in ways that stone tablets were not. A solar storm, a cyber attack, a collapse of the internet could erase vast amounts of data overnight. How much of our current civilization's knowledge exists only digitally, with no physical backup? The ancients, lacking our technology, invested in physical permanence. They carved their records in stone, built monuments that would endure. We build data centers, which require constant power and maintenance. If civilization were to collapse, our digital libraries would be lost within years, possibly months, as servers failed and storage degraded. The irony is that an ancient cuneiform tablet, baked clay, could survive millennia in the ground, while a hard drive might last a few decades at best, and only if conditions are ideal. This is why initiatives like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, the Arctic World Archive, and the Long Now Foundation's efforts to create enduring records are so important. They recognize the fragility of our current storage methods and attempt to create backups that will survive deep time. The Memory of Mankind project, for instance, is etching records onto ceramic tablets, storing them in a salt mine in Austria, intended to last for thousands of years. These efforts are modern echoes of the ancient impulse to build in stone, to create something that will outlast. But beyond physical storage, we must also consider cultural memory. How do we ensure that knowledge is not just preserved but transmitted, that future generations will understand what we leave behind? This is the challenge of the nuclear semiotics problem. How do you communicate danger or information to people 10,000 years in the future who might not speak your language, might not share your symbols, might not even think in the same cognitive frameworks? The solutions proposed, landscapes of thorns, ominous architecture, multilingual inscriptions, are attempts to create universal messages, but their success is uncertain. The ancients faced the same problem, and their solution was mythology. They encoded knowledge in stories, in rituals, in monuments, creating cultural mnemonic devices that would be passed down even if the explicit knowledge was lost. The myths preserved the essence. There was a flood, there were ancestors who taught us, there is a cosmic order, even if the details became embellished or distorted. We must learn from this. We must recognize that knowledge preservation is not just a technical problem but a cultural one. It requires institutions, traditions, and values that prioritize memory, education, and the transmission of wisdom across generations. As we stand at this moment in history with the power to alter the climate, to splice genes, to create artificial intelligence, we are in a position analogous to those ancient civilizations at their peaks. We have reached a level of complexity and capability that is both exhilarating and terrifying. What we do now will echo into the future, will be judged by descendants we will never meet, will perhaps be mythologized in stories told around fires or in whatever form human gathering takes in the centuries to come. Will they tell stories of us as we tell stories of the Sumerians? Will they puzzle over our ruins, wonder at our achievements, and speculate about what we knew and what we lost? Will they dig through the strata of our cities, finding fragments of our lives, our buildings, our art, our detritus, and attempt to reconstruct who we were? If we collapse, if our civilization is reset by climate catastrophe, nuclear war, pandemic, or some other disaster, what will survive? The great dams, perhaps, silent and crumbling. The skyscrapers, rusted steel skeletons. The highways, cracked and overgrown. And maybe, somewhere, a data cache that someone with the right technology could still read, if the knowledge of how to build that technology is also preserved. But more likely, what will survive are the stories, the myths, the cultural memories of a time when there were billions of people, when we could fly through the air, when we could speak instantly across the world, when we reached out and touched the moon. These will sound fantastic, impossible, the exaggerations of myth. And future archaeologists, if they arise, will debate whether these stories are literally true or merely symbolic, whether we were really as advanced as the legends say. And perhaps they will find, beneath our cities, layers older still, evidence of cycles before ours, and they will realize, as we are beginning to realize, that history is not a line but a spiral, that civilizations rise and fall, and that the quest for knowledge, for understanding, for building something that will last, is the enduring human journey. There is a strange comfort in this cyclical view, even as it is unsettling. It means we are not alone, not the first to face these challenges. It means that if we fail, others will come after, will rebuild, will ask the same questions. It means that the human story is larger than any single civilization, that we are part of something vast and ancient. But it is also a call to responsibility. If we have the knowledge that collapse is possible, that it has happened before, then we have the responsibility to try to prevent it, or at least to mitigate it, to preserve what we can for those who come after. This is not doomsaying. It is realism. Civilizations are not immortal. They are human constructs, complex and fragile, dependent on countless factors: climate, resources, social cohesion, knowledge, luck. When those factors align, civilizations flourish. When they diverge, civilizations decline. This is the pattern of history, and it is hubris to think we are exempt. But within that pattern, there is agency. We can choose to learn, to adapt, to build with an awareness of fragility. We can choose to preserve knowledge, to maintain networks, to cooperate across borders and cultures. We can choose to invest in sustainability, in resilience, in the long-term thinking that ancient builders demonstrated when they carved their messages in stone. The forbidden records of the first cities are not instructions for how to build a perfect civilization. They are evidence that perfection is not the goal. Endurance is. They show that humans can survive catastrophe, can rebuild, can carry forward the torch of knowledge even when the darkness seems overwhelming. And they remind us that our cities, for all their modernity, are not so different from those ancient ones. They are still gatherings of people seeking safety, prosperity, meaning. They are still experiments in living together, in organizing complexity, in creating beauty and order out of the chaos of existence. They are still, at their core, acts of hope. So as you lie there tonight, in whatever city or town you call home, listen for a moment to the sounds around you. The hum of electricity, the distant traffic, the neighbors, the heartbeat of the urban world. And remember that this same soundscape, in different forms, has echoed through cities for thousands of years. The crackle of fires, the calls of vendors, the footsteps on stone, the murmur of conversation, the songs and prayers and arguments that make up human life. Remember that beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations, beneath the soil, there are older layers, older cities, older lives. And remember that above you, the same stars shine that shone on those ancient peoples. The same moon waxes and wanes. The same sun rises and sets, indifferent to our struggles but constant, a reminder of the cosmic order in which we are a small but significant part. The first cities on Earth were not just places. They were ideas made manifest. They were the idea that we can create order, that we can build something larger than ourselves, that we can leave a mark on the world that will endure. That idea, born millennia ago, persists in every city that stands today. And it will persist, as long as there are humans to dream, to build, to remember. The records are not truly forbidden. They are merely waiting in the earth, in the myths, in the patterns of stars and the flow of rivers, in the very structures of our cities. They are waiting for us to read them, to understand them, to acknowledge that we are not the first and not the last, but part of a continuous story, a story of building and loss, of memory and forgetting, of hope and resilience. So listen, look, dig deeper, question. And when you find the anomalies, the things that don't fit, the layers that should not be there, do not dismiss them. Investigate, because in those forbidden records, in those suppressed layers, lies the truth of who we are and where we came from. And perhaps most importantly, where we are going. As we near the end of this journey through the forbidden records and the lost layers of our past, it is worth reflecting on what we have uncovered and what remains hidden. We have walked through the ruins of Eridu, stood beneath the Great Ziggurat, traced the flood layers that divide history into before and after. We have pondered the king list with its impossible reigns, considered the sudden sophistication of writing and architecture, and questioned the timelines that place the birth of civilization in a neat, comprehensible package. We have descended into the unexcavated strata, the sealed chambers, the political and logistical barriers that keep the deeper past hidden. We have examined anomalies, artifacts out of time, structures out of place, genetic and mythological clues that whisper of a story more complex than the one we are told. And we have asked the central question: if the Sumerians were not the first, then who were they remembering? The answer, if there is one, is not simple. It is not a single lost civilization, a Atlantis neatly located and documented. It is, rather, the understanding that humanity's urban experiment is older and more cyclical than we have acknowledged. That the cities we excavate are not necessarily the first, but the ones that survived, the ones built atop the ruins of earlier attempts. The answer is in the patterns, the repeated alignment of monuments to stars, the universal flood myths, the sudden emergence of complex societies without clear antecedents, the knowledge that seems inherited rather than invented. The answer is in the geology. The flood layers, the submerged coastlines, the climate shifts that would have destroyed coastal civilizations and driven survivors inland to rebuild. The answer is in the genetics, the bottlenecks, the migrations, the mixing of populations that suggest movements and events not recorded in any text. The answer is in the myths, the stories of gods and ancestors, of teachings and disasters, of a time before that was different, better, or at least more ancient than our histories allow. None of these alone is proof. Together, they form a preponderance of suggestion, a body of circumstantial evidence that invites us to reconsider, to be open to the possibility that we do not know as much as we think we do. And that is, perhaps, the most important takeaway. Intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is provisional, that the past is vast and mostly unknown, that every excavation reveals as much new mystery as it solves. The soil is deep, and we have only scratched the surface. But we are digging. With every new technology, LiDAR, ancient DNA analysis, ground-penetrating radar, AI translation of ancient texts, we peel back another layer. With every new generation of archaeologists, less bound by the assumptions of their predecessors, we ask new questions. With every amateur enthusiast combing through satellite imagery, every local villager stumbling upon a buried jar, we expand the map of the known. The forbidden records are being read, slowly, painstakingly. And as they are read, the story of human civilization grows richer, stranger, deeper. What will we find in the next decade, the next century? Will we finally excavate the deepest layers of Jericho, of Catalhoyuk, of Eridu? Will we send underwater archaeologists to map the continental shelves, to search for cities drowned by the post-glacial floods? Will we develop dating techniques that can reliably push back the timelines? Or will we find definitive evidence that the conventional chronology is correct after all? We do not know, but the quest itself is valuable. The act of seeking, of questioning, of refusing to accept easy answers. This is what drives knowledge forward. This is what separates inquiry from dogma. And so, as we conclude, we return to you, the listener. Where are you tonight? In what city? In what moment of your life? And what lies beneath you, literally and metaphorically? What histories, personal and collective, are you standing on? What memories are encoded in the places you inhabit, the structures you move through, the stories you tell? You are part of this story. You are a citizen of a city, a member of a civilization, a link in the chain that stretches back through millennia. What you do, what you build, what you preserve or destroy matters. It becomes part of the record, part of the strata that future archaeologists might one day excavate. Build well, remember faithfully, question bravely, and when you encounter the forbidden records, the anomalies, the things that don't fit, do not look away. Look closer, because in the margins, in the gaps, in the silences of history, lie the truths we are not yet ready to acknowledge but which we must, eventually, confront. The first cities on Earth were acts of hope, of defiance against the transience of life. They said, we were here, we mattered, we built something that will last. And they have lasted, in ruins and in memory, long enough for us to find them and to wonder. May our cities do the same. May they stand long enough for someone, millennia from now, to find them and to wonder at us, to ask who we were, what we knew, what we dreamed. And may they find that we left records, not forbidden but open, clear, generous, that help them understand, that give them the knowledge they need to build their own cities, to continue the human experiment, to reach for the stars as we reached, and as our ancestors reached before us. The story is not over. It is never over. As long as there are people, there will be cities. And as long as there are cities, there will be stories, layers, memories, and mysteries. Dig deeper. Look closer. Remember, the Earth is patient, and it remembers everything. It is waiting for us to remember too. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forbidden records of the first cities on Earth. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity, if it has invited you to see history differently, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what ancient ground do you stand upon? Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, the past is never truly past. It is here, beneath us, around us, within us, waiting to be discovered.